So yeah, my name's Randy Striplin. I'm the Forest Service Regional Fuels Planner, one of two fuels planners in the region. Prior to that, I was a fire planner on the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit from 2007 to 2017. And this project really was came about a long time ago based on the ability to get sufficient amounts of prescribed fire on the ground and really trying to characterize what the constraints and opportunities might actually look like for planning a prescribed fire program. And then did it change slides? Not sure what's going on here. Apologies.
Sometimes it's a little slow. Maybe just hit page down again or the arrow down one more time.
Is it changing? It's not changing. Okay.
There we go.
I have to click my other monitor.
It went down this time. Okay.
So yeah, and so Stephanie McAfee at University of Reno and also the Nevada State climatologist is a co-author, as well as Hugh, who you all know, and then also Mike Papa, who's used to be on the Lake Tahoe Basin, a forester, and is now in Florida, the National Forests of Florida, working there as a forester. So, you know, we've already been talking about the great amount of, sorry, I'm still having problems having my screens match up. I'm not going to waste a lot of time describing, you know, what the issue is here and why we need to get more fire on the ground. We talked about that pretty extensively today. It's just that, you know, all the fire exclusion. So it's pretty obvious. Really, if anything, this year really demonstrates what we have feared was going to happen is happening. So we really need to drastically increase the pace and scale. So my phone's ringing, sorry about that. So yeah, obviously we need to get more fire on the ground, and this was really a project that looked at, you know, what were the things that were really, some of the things that were really holding us back, and could we find a way to identify the opportunities in between those constraints. So that's what this came out. And so we're really going to look at some things that have to occur when you go to light a fire. What are the conditions you actually need to have that are occurring at that moment or that day? And this is aside from the efforts that must occur well in advance, such as the environmental compliance, preparing burn plans, you know, and budgeting and staffing your program, right? All those things happen well in advance, but then you need to be able to have certain conditions met before you can actually light a prescribed fire. And so what we did is we looked at the record from 1999 through 2019, looking at the three main components of burn windows. Obviously, it's pretty complicated, but these three main things are understood by managers as limiting. And so the first one is issuance of a burn permit by the air district. Secondly, weather is within your burn plan criteria. So your RHs, your wind speeds, your fuel moistures, and that sort of thing. And also that you have the resources needed to conduct the burn. And so of note, in case folks weren't aware, the California Air Resources Board, they issue burn day or no burn day decisions for every day, for every basin in California from 1999 through the present. And that data are available online, and that's what we use for this. And then a typical burn plan prescription for the Lake Tahoe Basin. Right, yeah, a specific burn may vary somewhat from this based on but a typical one would be, winds less than 20 foot winds, which is how they're measured at a RAWS station, 20-foot winds less than 25 miles per hour. And then you'd want your 10-hour dead fuel moisture to be between, say, 7% and 20%, and your relative humidity above 20%, but less than 50%. Obviously, there's some wiggle room in there sometimes depending on, but these have to be specified in your burn plan, what you want them to be before you're allowed to ignite. And then the data we used came from RAWS, Remote Automated Weather Station data. And then preparedness levels, we use that as a surrogate for resource availability. And we'll all show that it's not the greatest surrogate, but we use it as a surrogate for when the crews would be available for burning. And these are the preparedness levels are issued by the Geographic Area Coordination Centers, and it's based on how many crews and engines and other resources are available or committed to incidents, and also what is the fire danger, the current and predicted fire danger. So at PL3, it's when there may be enough fire activity that having enough resources to help you implement a prescribed fire are going to start being competed for. So we selected preparedness levels less than 3. Can you guys see a graph now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm just checking them. I don't know what's going on, but mine's not quite working the way I was hoping it was going to work. So yeah, so as I said before, the burn days are designated by the California Air Resources Board as permissible for burning. So what this shows is that the proportion of days for that period, 1999 through 2019, 21 years, the proportion of each day of the year, that was a burn day. So the blue line just shows what that was, and you could see the pattern that probably most folks, whether you've seen it or not, are familiar or understand that probably, in the summer, those days are going to be lower due to ridging and more inversions and, better dispersion during the spring and the fall. So you can see that clearly here. Maybe perhaps the winter, the low points in the winter maybe not be expected, but for a high elevation forest where you have a lot of snow on the ground often and you get a inversion based on a sort of a temperature inversion at the surface do that. So you see that low point in the winter. And then also point out that it's not just smoke that the air boards, the air districts have to consider for burn days, because a lot of it is California obviously has a lot of sources of pollution. So and a lot of them are a lot of the air districts are in non-attainment, a lot of the airsheds. So it might be other things than smoke that are leading to whether a day is called a burn day or not. And then here we add in the weather. So now we add in this red line. It's the same thing, the proportion of days that were within those weather criteria that I showed you earlier. And so we could see the red line are the days that had wind speeds less than 25 miles an hour, RHs between 20 and 50%, and 10-hour dead fuel moistures between 7 and 20%. And so one thing that I note right away is being a person that's been working in fuels for a long time, contrary to popular belief, I think it's becoming understood now, but the burn days were rarely more limiting than the days that were in prescription. So you see that, in other words, that the red line is lower than the blue line in most cases. So that was more limiting based on this study than the days that were had burn permits by the air district. Also, I'll point out from this slide that these are often out of phase, especially the example here is in January, right? So you see the red and the blue lines are fairly close together. So that would indicate that about 50% of the days were in prescription, about 50% of the days were burn days. But we'll see later that those weren't in phase and weren't always occurring at the same time. And again, that seasonal pattern is evident in the prescriptions too. And then we add in the preparedness level less than 3, and you can see that's really almost any time during the winter and early spring that the burn days or the preparedness level was less than 3. The only time it seems to come into play is when you start getting into the between June and October. So this is one of the reasons why I said it was really an imperfect surrogate, because obviously in reality crews are laid off during the fall and the winter. A lot of the folks on the crews are laid off. So this does not reflect that. It just reflects the sort of commitment of crews. So when when they're not committed to wildfires, they're obviously the crews may not even be staffed, and that's not reflected here. And then now the shaded area, we're going to bring in when all 3 of those criteria are met simultaneously. So the shaded area, that represents the proportion of the time that each day of the year was a burn window. And so that's the pattern that anybody that's attempted to, at least in the West, and in particular the Lake Tahoe Basin, that's the pattern that's going to support their experience that they would expect to see burn windows. And so, and then the space between the shading and the lines. So if you look at January again, it becomes evident that since during that time, the PL level was not eliminated at all, and burn days and days in prescription were each at about 50%. But yet the gray shading area is a lot lower. So you can see there's a good proportion of the time that those were just not in phase, if that makes any sense. And then the next thing we're going to look at is, often, so what we've been looking at is individual days, single days, solitary days. And we know that in order to conduct more complex and larger burns, you really need more than a solitary burn window. So here we group burn windows into multiple consecutive day groupings, and each group was exclusive. In other words, there's no 2 to 3 day group that's included in a 4 to 5 day group. So for interpretation of this, obviously April had the most multi-day burn windows available, but they're still pretty rare. This is over the whole 21-year period. April only averaged 2 burn windows that were 2 to 3 days in length, and less than 1 over 21 years that was of 4 to 5 days in length. So you could see that those consecutive periods are pretty rare. So being able to understand when those are going to be, when you're most likely to be able to conduct more complex burns would be important. And also another point is, working with our partners, the air districts or wherever the constraints are, and trying to say, maybe you have a solitary day, but then you have a non-burn day, then you expect a better day or a couple days in a row. You might be able to work out the ability to string those days together through one of your partners like the air district, if they're amenable to that. And they've shown that air districts and CARB are just tremendously willing partners to help us increase the pace and scale of burning. So we've come a long way in that. And then the next thing we looked at was annual variability. So obviously, this would be important to know if you're building a prescribed burn program, how, you know, if in other words, if you built a program for, say, you know, what 2002 and 2003 looked like, right? If you had that program in place, and then 2008, 2009, you got sort of a totally different looking period. And if you were staffed up for one period, you might not have enough to take the opportunity for a year that had more opportunities, or vice versa. You know, you might have to find some work for a bunch of folks that you had on staff that really didn't have the windows to burn. So even the months that typically have the highest proportion of burn windows, they exhibit a lot of variability from year to year. And you know, for instance, October sometimes had 0 windows, right? And generally that's understood as a good time to burn. But that's also when your folks, just before your folks get laid off. So if you don't have windows in October, and then you go laying folks off, you might miss some opportunities. Yeah, and then in terms of burn windows, you know, 2019 would have been a great year for burning. I don't know how optimistic or how opportunistic the agencies in the Lake Tahoe Basin were, and how much they actually got done that year. But I suspect they probably did not take advantage of as many opportunities they had. And a particular note on this, on 2019, around 95%. This was really interesting. About 95% of the days of the whole year of 2019 were designated as burn days by CARB. So that was pretty interesting, and that's actually a rare. And that data is not shown. These are burn windows shown here. The data is not shown, but just out of the 365 days in 2019, about 95% days issued by CARB. So, kind of what does it all mean? And really, what are we looking at? We're trying to understand, what's the likelihood that we are going to be able to meet the objectives using prescribed fire? So a few notes, we've already talked about these a little bit. Most the historical fire season was primarily summer, fall, but there is evidence of early season fire in the Lake Tahoe Basin. So you need to, what are your objectives? There may be some options that you can meet in spring burning, like Ed was talking about, and also just shout out to Ed. I thought that was great. I wasn't aware of that stuff that you've been working on with Daniel and John. Probably need to talk to you about that at some point. But so, when we're talking about, what's really important when you're trying to burn, what are your objectives? And fuel moisture is going to be a key, right? Because fuel moisture is going to determine the fuel consumption, the patchiness, what kind of shrub and tree mortality you might see. So, the objectives of the particular project will give you some information on if you should burn early season or late season. And also, there's ignition patterns and all kinds of other stuff you can do. But if your primary objective is fuel consumption, or maybe creating a little mortality, maybe creating some openings, then you should burn when the fuel moisture is low. So typically late season before you have any moisture. The good thing about burning in the late season too is often, some years we have storms, and they put rain on the ground in the fall. Maybe we'll see some of that this year, but sometimes you can that'll help you out, in sort of helping you put the fire out, and really ease some of your efforts on patrolling and mop up and things like that. So sometimes that plays in your favor. If your primary objective is creating a patchy mosaic, or say consuming less litter and duff. And Ed kind of talked about this, maybe your initial burn in the spring, you know, and you really don't want it to get too hot because you don't want it to burn all the, some of the effects in some of the earlier presentations showed that when you burn, when there's a lot of duff and stuff, there's a lot more mortality, right? So if maybe burning during the spring, you can leave a little bit more of that and more patchy distribution. So early season burning may be suitable for that. And then obviously, if you're trying to control the shrub understory, it's going to depend on what the species is and what its, reestablishment strategy is for the different shrubs you're trying to control. And then important, aspect of this is, are your crews going to be fully staffed for large complex burns during the spring? Perhaps not. So maybe if that's when most opportunities occur, perhaps folks need to start looking at alternative staffing patterns. And then, so yeah, the patterns we've shown that there's these support what's perceived by experienced managers. Obviously, summer had the fewest burn windows of any season, but sometimes conditions during the summers are suitable for burning, and there was plenty of times during 2019, there wasn't a lot of fire activity in the region, and there was good conditions for prescribed burning up in Lake Tahoe Basin. And again, I don't know, I wasn't working there at the time, so I don't know exactly what got done, but there were definitely opportunities. And I'll just point out, part of this, study was really, the first part of the study was, well, how much do we need to burn, right? So studies have shown that, hundreds to thousands of hectares burned every year historically, pre-European settlement, and usually at 200 to 400 hectares in size, based on some huge research. And the basin averages about less than 100 burn windows per year, right? So if you needed to burn 1,000 hectares a year, and you burn 10 hectares on every burn, right? You could get to 1,000, but perhaps you want to be more opportunistic and do larger burns at optimal times. And you may end up taking, maybe burn piles on a lot of those, but find the windows that string together a few days and have the conditions you need to really meet your objectives. Also note that carb, one of the things to do is a trend analysis whenever we did this, and we noticed an increasing trend. Wasn't actually a trend, it was a bump that occurred in 2008 whenever we sort of looked at the individual parameters to see which one was really responsible for the bump. It ended up being the carb burn days. So then, talking to folks at carb, found out that they had sort of adjusted their criteria in 2008 following the Angora fire. So what that did was created more burn days. So that's what affected the burn window analysis. So it just shows that, carb is more than willing to work with us and try, and they're interested in getting more fire on the ground. They understand the problem, and so, we really need to take those opportunities and work with them as much as possible. And then this is a slide just showing a spring burn in 2010. So Slaughterhouse Canyon in Lake Tahoe Basin, and just showing, the mortality in June. So a couple months after the burn, there was some red and some mortality. And then a couple years later, right, it really looks good out there. Obviously, this is just looking at the canopy, which looks good. It's not looking at the at any of the understory or anything, but it was definitely, it was a pile burn, but we actually let it creep between piles. So it was a lot like an understory burn. We actually would, put a little drag some fire between the piles to burn some of the duff and the litter and some of the shrubs. So with that, that's it.